Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Catholic ReCon Testimonies from Reverts and Converts. I'm your host, Eddie Trask. Please subscribe, please like, please share, please comment. This week's guest is Sarah Howard. Sarah, welcome to the
Thank
show.
you.
Thank you so much for being here. Let's just get right into it, Sarah. What was your upbringing like, religious and otherwise?
It was religious. I was raised Protestant and I was raised as a fifth generation Nazarene, which was a lovely tradition. And it's kind of the less heretical end of the Protestant spectrum.
Mm,
But it was a lovely tradition, lots of music, lots of family, lots of things that I'd been a part of for as long as I could remember, that my parents had also been a part of, that my great grandparents had also been a part of. So
yeah.
I came by it honestly, and there was a lot of good community, a lot of things that I enjoyed. I belonged to a really great group of people and a lot of really great things, a lot of good traditions. And so I had a great childhood. I had great parents who were Christian, who raised us well and who gave us a lot of things that any kid could have asked for, and really taught us that Christianity is both faith and reason. And it's not one or the other, that you have to have both of those. And that's something that I have been forever grateful for, because I think a lot of people are just given faith
Yes.
and not taught how that plays out in the world. And my parents were very involved in the pro-life circles. They're avid readers. They're big history buffs. They're big on reading anything to do with science, philosophy. And so all of those things, if faith is that pillar, all of those things kind of hold up the pillar, so that when your faith wavers, you're going, I'm not
Yes.
crazy for thinking this. All of these things hold it up too. Even the ancients believed this, something to do with this. They just didn't have the fulfillment. So
Absolutely.
I had a really good upbringing, not to say that, I took it all immediately, or, still working, but it was a good upbringing and I
That's
enjoyed
great.
it.
Now, Nazarene, Church of the Nazarene, can you remind me when did that church begin and where did it branch from, if you know a little bit of that history?
I want to say 130 years. I think about 10 years ago in NU, Northwest Nazarene University had their 100-year anniversary.
Okay,
And that was for the university. And then
sure.
the denomination started up sometime before that. But I want to say about 130 years. I could
Okay.
be wrong. But it's not on the Calvinist bent.
Yes.
So there's none of the predestination, any of that stuff. It's fairly quiet. I did have a ballet recital there when I was at our church, at the little community
Yeah.
part of it, because it had a little stage, and we got letters from the old ladies because Nazarenes don't dance. And so the pastor received letters for the ballet recital, which was funny. But David danced, so there is a time to dance and
Oh my gosh,
a time
there.
to be still, which
Yeah,
was
it's funny,
great
the
though.
spectrum, the spectrum for any denomination, it's pretty wide, especially when you get varied splits off of each other. You're going to have this very fundamentalist arm and then this very progressive. At least that's what I've seen in a number of denominations. So, but like you said, your upbringing, you had a nice balance. Did you have any? I should ask this of more people. In the teenage years, as you're trying to find your identity, all these things, did you ever question what you had been taught? Do you remember questioning that, or did you just accept it and go through life kind of with a smile on your face? Because you said you had a good childhood. You had everything you needed.
I did, and I think I had less of that. There was something in college which I can get to, but
Yeah.
at least in high school, there were a lot of answers, and I don't understand this. And so there was always something scientific to back it up, something historical to back it up, something that the ancient philosophers believed to back it up, something in Judaism to back it up, because Judaism is just a tiny step away from the early church, because the early Christians were Jews and everything was very familiar. And I was raised with this kind of knowledge of early church history, because that was never something that was foreign. That was always something that my mom grew up with, as a Protestant pastor's kid, but her parents had good friends who were Catholics, or family that were Catholic, and so they had. I didn't have a huge understanding of that, but the I guess the open-minded liberal aspect to early church was not a closed Protestant box. So we were able to kind of see early church fathers, and not maybe explicitly by name all the time, but at least it was open to finding what was true.
And that is such an important point to be able to say that. I think Catholics that are trying to defend the faith, I've done it, I know, just blanket all Protestants and say, well, they don't even know about the early church, when in fact, many of them may know the early church. That doesn't mean that they understand it as a Catholic would understand it. So do you know how they, in practice, would they just say, hey, that's part of the Christian tradition. I don't really care if that was a bishop, so to speak. I'm just going to understand them in this complex tapestry and they were part of the Christian tradition. I mean, how do you, I don't know if you can answer that, but how would you reconcile some of those writings if you know early church? It's like you can see it, but you don't see it at the same time. I know some people have said that.
Yes, and I think that there might have been more of that in friends of ours than in my family specifically. And the majority of my memories with that were at the time that my mom started looking into the Catholicism specifically. So that kind of had more of a title by the
Yep.
time I was about 15, 16, and really started listening to where's the reason behind it. So as a little kid, my parents taught the 3-year-old class for years, I think like 9 years, by the time all my siblings and I were through there. And so they would teach creation, and it was like, here's God created light, but the sun and the moon weren't created yet. Do you know what that is, kids? That's energy. And so there was always something to do with a logical reason, looking at the actual world, whether that was in history or science or whatever. So it wasn't foreign, but by the time that I was really looking at it as an early teenager or mid teenager, it kind of was starting to get more of a name.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so then you advance into college. What did you study in college?
Theater arts and English.
Okay.
I
Was
like
there,
stories.
what was that? Say that again.
I said I like stories.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So, do you remember any, I think you did allude to an experience there. Did you have any classes related to the subject whatsoever? I mean, sometimes you can have electives. People will say that they took a religious elective and, whoa, I didn't know that. Like they learned something that they didn't know. What was your experience like?
I think it was less of the electives and more of the outside environment from my family going into the college years. And that started when I was 16. There was the Terry Schiavo case in Florida. And she was a young woman who had had cardiac arrest and was on, basically, her husband said she was a vegetable and wanted to pull the hydration tube, the feeding tube, and the court sided with him. And it ended up ruling that those would be removed, and it took her 13 days to die. But my mom started noticing that the people who, by and large, were standing up for her life and her dignity were disproportionately Catholic. Not to say that there weren't good Protestant people in pro life circles, because my parents were always at pro life events. I was practically like born at a pro life rally, but because they were just always down there. But a lot of them, there were good Protestant people too, but a lot of them were Catholic. So by the time you start to hear that around 16, 17, 18, and then you go off to college, you're starting to kind of see the world a little bit differently. And then you find yourself as a Protestant defending the Catholics, and you're not quite sure what to do with it. Because I mean, my parents, like I said, were avid readers, and John Henry Newman said to be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. So you start to get more and more of that, and you start to see this world a little bit differently. And then I got to college. I transferred multiple times, and transferring is a credit hog, but I ended up having a great time and made some lifelong friends. But one of the professors at one of the colleges that I went to, when I walked in the office, I had a question completely related to one of the classes. And I looked over and he had a broadsword on his wall, really an intellectual guy. And there was a rosary wrapped around the hilt. And I stopped and I said, "You have a rosary?" And he said, "Oh, well, yes, I do." And I said, "Oh." And I asked my question. And I thought right then, I think I found an ally. And then 2 years ago, he told me that he had become Catholic, and I was like, I knew it. But it wasn't really an elective, but it started to see that the people who were kind of this beautiful thought toward the arts, which I really loved, and my mom has always loved it. Both my parents have music and literature and theater.
Yeah.
One of my other professors said, I worship by creating beautiful things. And that takes on a whole new meaning once you find Catholicism, because there's all
Yes.
this loveliness in Protestantism where you can see the grace of God, the beauty of God. But there's this whole pre-hashed out philosophy of the good, the true, and the beautiful, and all of these other doctrines and all of this other history that just gives this huge framework to this beautiful thing that you're seeing. And if you're going into it seeing and searching for what is good, true, and beautiful, and creating things that are lovely and searching for truth, then it kind of just it all kind of morphed together, and it was this snowball that kept on moving.
Okay, what was the next step? Where the wheels were in motion, did you start to notice that you were changing? Because you were already saying it's kind of weird to kind of defend the Catholics as a Protestant. Did you notice that you were perhaps defending the Catholic faith a little bit more around family, or how did you progress in that mindset?
Not around family. The family were fine. Even the family members who aren't Catholic, they
Yeah,
understand the history, and there's some things that maybe you don't get, but nobody's arguing with it really. So I've been very lucky that way, that nobody's multiple family members of mine have become Catholic, but even those who haven't, nobody's fighting about it. Everybody's on the same page, no family upsets. So that's
it's
really nice,
incredible.
but it's
Wow.
very, yes, very much so. But that's what comes with parents who want to search for truth. And
Yes.
I teach classes somewhere else, and I told him, if you want to search for the truth wholeheartedly, then go for it, but just be prepared, you'll find it. So watch out if you want to actually search for it, it will show up. But it wasn't hard friend losing debates by any means, but at college I would have these discussions with some friends, and at least it was something where if I'm reasoning through it to try to answer their questions, then it started to make more and more sense, because the more you have to look up the reasons for things and the background to whatever you think you're saying,
Okay.
the more that it starts to fall into place. But I think one of the big things that happened is in between school years, in a summer, I was I was going to a Protestant Bible study, and I heard that they were doing a summer missions trip, and they needed 5 people. They had 4, and they wanted the last one to be a girl. And I was like, oh, that's me. And I knew it. I knew it right away. And I said, God wants me to go to this. And I said, well, I already applied for a job, so if I don't get that job, then I'll go. And right then I knew I was not getting that job, and I didn't, so I went. So during that, it was a summer missionary job. And as I'm going around to all these different churches doing VBS and all this other stuff, I woke up one morning and the sky was blue and the sun was clear, and it was, but this weight hit me that just said there is no God. And I was completely abandoned. And there's nothing. God doesn't exist. And it was just this devastation hit me out of nowhere, and I tanked hardcore. And I can't explain it other than to say it was a 3-year dark night of the soul that was the deepest I had ever been. And it took 3 years to climb out of, with I finally going back to square one over and over and over, that there is a creation, so there must be a creator. And that it was my square one that I came back to all the time. And finally, one of these times I said to my mom, well, I think that there's a God, but what do I do with Jesus? And she said, well, that's always been the question, hasn't it? What do we do with Jesus? And that's true. So it kept coming back to that. But we were talking about, my mom and I were talking about the Beatitudes. And she said the very first one is, blessed are the poor in spirit. And the poor in spirit means to understand that there is a God and I'm not him, and that I don't understand, and that I need to understand. And if you would please help me, I would greatly appreciate it, because I'm at the end of my rope here. So a few things happened throughout this whole time, but God was very good and gave me what I needed when I needed it. And at one point, I remember sitting on my bed, and I don't even know who said this, but this was at the college where I found the kindred spirit professor. And I was sitting on my bed reading the book of John, because I was on my last straw. And I remembered somebody saying that when they were on their last straw, they had somebody tell them to read the book of John, and to read it as if they had never heard it before. Read it as if you're there and you're seeing it for the first time. So read it like you haven't heard it. And so I said, okay, well, all right. And so I was reading the book of John, and things started to pop out strangely. And then finally I got to John 17, and Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's gone away from the disciples, and he's praying, and he prays for himself, and he prays for the apostles. And then he says that I pray for those who who will come to believe in me through their word. And it was like in front of me, this room, this college dorm room disappeared. And if I could paint, I'm not a good artist, but if I could paint, I would paint this Jesus in Gethsemane on his knees, just looking up into the heavens. And it's this vast pool of fog, of mist. And every person who's ever existed throughout time is appearing before him at that time. And it clears. And there's me sitting on my bed in tears saying, will you please help me? And it was like at that minute, it's like, I see you. I do see you. Don't worry. Like, keep going. And so that was part of my 3-year dark night of the soul, but God's been good.
Oh my goodness. So yeah, these little consolations along the way that kept you going. 3 years, that's a heck of an ordeal. So how did you crawl out of this pit, so to speak, this emptiness? I've had different people describe this in different ways and what it looks like. But once you came out of that period, what did that feel like? Was it incredible energy, or was it like a clearing where you're calm? What was it? What was it like?
It was like a trickle. It wasn't a huge shebang. There was a little chapel on campus that just said, pray always, pray without ceasing on the door. And so I would go in there. It was hardly anything. I've been back several times to this campus since, and they've really renovated it and it looks kind of modern and cool. But then it was just a building with a blank platform at the front and some pews. And so I would go in there, and somebody, because this was the campus I was on, would leave note cards for people to put prayer requests or whatever was on, whatever they were thinking about or praying about. And so I just, at one point, right before that ordeal I just described, I wrote on there kind of my last desperate plea, and I left it there because I felt like I couldn't feel anything. And I felt like my heart was just like a rock. Like it wouldn't beat, it wouldn't do anything. And I was just like, I don't know what to do. And so at one point I'd gone back, and somebody had laid them all out nicely across the front because they'd laid them out and they'd prayed for each one. And one of them was a little lopsided. And I thought, oh, that's strange. So I went over and I picked it up, and it was my card. And under it, somebody had found a rock that looked like a heart, and they had put it there. And it was like God said, let this one be your heart of stone so you don't have to have one. And so it's like these little things that would just, it wasn't like a huge flood of faith, but it was like, okay, you've got one more step. Continue on, and I will be there for you. And my grace is new every single morning, which is really something. But you can look at the histories of peoples who have not been forsaken and
Yes.
have lived in hope. And so it was kind of this coming through. Something else that was kind of interesting, because I grew up in, not grew up, but I had a music loving family, and my cousins were always showing us, because one of my cousins works for the San Diego Opera, and he was always showing us the Phantom of the Opera, different Broadway shows, and it was always something that was around. And so I kind of grew up with this, and then I started being in theater productions, and I was in, for 10 years, I was in, always in a production, and sometimes 2 and occasionally 3 at a time. So it was always something. And then right after college, that was my first year that I was in nothing. And for the first time, I was just me alone with the world and with God and myself, going, I wonder who I am.
Yeah.
And you knew who you are. It's not something that I was having an identity crisis or hadn't really thought about who I was, but it was just different. And so that was time to really kind of explore a little bit more and kind of become a little more grounded and learn more, get more involved. And the after college years are definitely weirder than the college years. So you really have to find somewhere where you belong. You have to find a community, which was something else that was strange getting into Catholicism, because I grew up with a community and I
Yeah.
didn't have one there. So there was a lot that way too.
Okay. So what was the next big, I guess, moment on that path? I'm assuming you didn't just jump right into RCIA. What did you?
No, let's think. I flirted with Catholicism for over 15 years. I think it was like 17 by the time all was said and done. So it started back when I was 15, 16, and that Terry Schiavo case, and my mom started looking into it. And being the avid reader that she read, she was always sharing with us all of these things. And so it kind of, it upsets the fruit basket when you start learning things, because eventually once you start to notice things, I went through those years, got through college, found myself as a young adult looking around for a community, and really started looking for somewhere to be, and started going to mass because, well, we had moved cities and my mom was going, and it was a little far to go to the other church that I grew up in, even though that was where I grew up. That was where my grandparents got married. That was the church. And so I started going to mass with my mom. And the first time, being a theater person, the first time that I was in mass, I'm always looking for the things that should be moved, that somebody should be coming in here, and I'm analyzing it. And one of the first times I was in mass, I was listening to the homily, and the priest finished, and he went and sat down, and there was silence, and nobody moved. And I'm looking around like somebody forgot a line. Somebody's missing something. Somebody's supposed to be entering, and everybody's really good at keeping their cool, but man, something's missing here. And then I figured out that's on purpose, and that's for me. That's for me to listen to what was just said in response to the gospel. And then I thought, oh, okay, that's smart. That's really organized. And so I started going to mass sometime around that time after I got out of college. And you get to a point where you kind of look at it and you learn some more things and you think that's really cool. And then you learn something you don't understand, and then you get mad at it, and so you leave. And so that happened a few times because you have to make sense of it. So if there are other people who are looking at Catholicism and are interested in it or interested in coming back and things don't make sense, then that's okay. That's okay. You take your time, look through the things, because you want to find the truth. And the great thing about Catholicism is that all the answers are already there. You just have to find them and figure out why. So that's something that was very, very comforting, because I like things to have a reason. Yep. And I just finished actually reading Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And the thing that he kind of harps on is that people can have a what and a how, but if they don't have a why, then it's not going to make sense to them. They're going to leave it. And that's one of the lovely things about Catholicism, is everything has a reason. And most of the time it is old as dirt, because most of the time it comes from Judaism. So there's something that backs it up, and it's more of this understanding of a fulfillment of Old Testament to New. So going back and forth, learning all of the things, and you get mad at it and you get all feisty and you're like, oh, I don't like that. And so you ditch it for a little while, and then you come back to it. And eventually got into RCIA, and I ended up going through RCIA somewhere between 2.5 and 3 times, because I would go through and I just wanted information. Yep. And then I was out of it for a while. Yep. And then I went through it again, and it was almost there. And I actually even got through my first confession day of the vigil. And then I said, I can't do it. I can't do it. And it was just, I was not ready. And so I backed out and I didn't do it.
Well, okay. Hold on. What year was the first time you went to RCIA? What year was that? And then you return in what year? I'm curious always about years.
I'm trying to remember. So I converted last year. When was that? 2023. So I think the second one was 2021.
Okay.
2020, 2021. And so the first one must have been either 2018 or 19.
Okay. So in between each of those, to your earlier point, you had to go understand the why behind some of the things that you had learned.
You got to regroup.
You got to regroup, catch your breath a little bit. Kind of a big topic.
Yeah. It's a big topic. There's a lot there. And one of the things that is really important that I feel like nobody says to a lot of people, but I had sisters who converted before me. And one of the things that they said to me, that it is okay, is that you do become metaphysically homeless, and you have been removed from everything that you have known, and you don't belong anywhere else yet. And so it's this weird, really, time of mourning where you're metaphysically homeless. You have nowhere to be. You belong nowhere, and you don't know what to believe. And so it's this very strange time where it really is a period of mourning, and that's okay too. But one thing that was very important to me is that I started to notice that if I wanted to search for truth, it was actually quite shocking, because if you want to search for truth, it's not that my previous tradition was entirely incorrect. It was just that it was incomplete. And I started to notice that there might be something that had more answers that could take me closer to God than the previous place.
Yeah.
But even so, people were not meant to be torn away from their traditions. We were always supposed to be one church. And so it really is something that is tragic in some ways, to be pulled away from something that you are so grafted to.
Are you going to write
In
a
some
book,
ways.
Sarah? My goodness. I think you
I don't know.
I think you need to. I really do. You've had some pretty profound insights, and we're not even all the way to you becoming Catholic. So I really, really appreciate what you just said. Um, okay. Sorry if I broke your train of thought there. Were you saying something else about the the fact that there is the mourning happening, the fact that you're feeling what a lot of people that go through divorce feel, whether they are separating, and you can kind of get into, if you could get into the shoes of the Reformation, you can start to just feel this, something being torn asunder, as
Mhm.
as the Bible says. And likewise, trying to put these things back together, there's going to be a lot of heartache. There's going to be a lot of pain, a lot of baggage, to say the least. And
But
so,
one thing you start to notice is that you're not leaving God behind.
yeah,
And once you can realize that, then everything that is new and strange and somber suddenly doesn't seem so foreign anymore, because you realize that there is that same ground, and the same friend you had here is over here. You can just see him a little clearer.
yeah, that makes sense. Very good. Okay, so the second time you go, you said you made it almost all the way.
Almost all the way.
Almost all the way. That emotion had to be different than the first time where you just went through the inquiry phase. It sounded like a lot of questions. Okay, now I need to research on my own. This time you're there, wedding night, so to speak. Get cold feet, say, I need to regroup. Do you remember the emotions at that time?
Yeah, there were lots of tears. And the great thing about the first confession, where I was sitting there just blubbering to this priest, was that that priest happened to be, I don't think he knew this, and I didn't know it at the time, but that happened to be a priest that 30 years earlier, maybe even 40 years earlier, my parents had played Trivial Pursuit with. And I've heard this story all my life, that my
What?
mom and another friend were on one team, and my dad and this priest were on the other team, and they knew everything. So they would just dominate Trivial Pursuit because they were all in the pro-life circles together. And so God in his goodness gives me this priest for this, fake, real good first confession. And I was just beside myself. And I went to this RCIA director, who is, bless her heart, so patient and so good. And I just said, I can't do it. And it was just that panicky type feeling where I don't know, I can't do it. And she said,
Yeah.
okay, well, if you change your mind, then just give me a look when we start calling people up, and I'll just include your name. And so she even looked over at me and kind of raised her eyebrows. And I was sitting there sinking into my chair at the vigil, because I went to the vigil. I don't remember if we had a friend going through that year or not. We've been to a couple, and usually it's when somebody's going through. Um, but I couldn't do it. And so I just said, I gotta jittery. And I've
Yeah.
known people who have kind of felt like they needed to go through. And in a little bit, it's kind of traumatizing when you feel like you've had kind of harsh Catholics telling you what to do,
Sure.
telling you, if you're not Catholic, you're going to hell,
Sure.
and it's just like this weird culture where sometimes you get pushed into it and it is traumatizing. You realize you're on the side of something that is true, but at the same time, you resent being there. And I was so thankful that I did not have that experience, and I had the space and the good people to help me walk through in my own time.
Well, I did an interview with John Michael Talbot, and he was talking about how we
Oh,
don't push people into the pool. We invite them into the pool, and they come in according to God's timing, and you have to trust that they have the willingness, the openness to experience what they, or to pursue truth at their speed.
mm-hmm.
But when you get overzealous, start to push people, that's not appealing. I just spoke to someone the other day that said that if these guys knew what they were doing as far as pushing, just constantly talking about, well, the truth, why don't you just jump in, and not walking with the person, getting impatient. So I think what you're saying is spot on. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And somebody said, my mom's one of these people, wherever you find Jesus is where you need to be. And most of the time, if people really want to find Jesus, they're going to start to look.
Yeah.
And, C.S. Lewis never did make it to Catholic, even though
Yep.
he was the best friend of J.R.R. Tolkien.
Yeah.
And but look at how the world has changed because of one man, even though he wasn't Catholic. But I think that he was a searcher. And one thing he said in I think Screw Tape Letters, he said, as long as the will to walk is there, God is pleased with even our stumbles. And that's very, very true. He also said, even the man who sometimes says, forget this, I got to go, and is searching, he is oftentimes closer to God than the man who sits in the pew and says, I have found the truth, but he doesn't actually listen. So there is room to explore and to search, and God will always honor the search and the struggle and the tears and the feeling metaphysically homeless. And there's always something on the other side, as long as you're honestly searching for the purpose of becoming closer to Jesus and to find who that is, then you're kind of good. You'll end up where you need to be.
Well, we all have to deal with the biases that we have. And when we say, "Oh, I'm surrendered, Lord," really? How we all have to check ourselves with that. When we make a statement like that, I'm surrendered. I'll
I'm
go
so
wherever,
humble.
yeah, I'll go wherever he wants me to go. Really? We need to check ourselves and ask that question on a regular basis. Okay, so Sarah, the period between that second, when once you left Vigil, between that and joining the church last year, that was a period of roughly 2 years. What was that experience like? Were you going to Mass? Were
Mhm.
you reading the Catechism, reading the Bible? What were you doing those years?
Yeah, all of it I was going to mass. So you get mad at it, but you on some level realize that there's something solid there and it becomes more familiar. And then you go to um, a different type of service. And while they're still loving Jesus, you find that it's just a little bit shallower. And so, in going closer to Catholicism, you are ascending into the depths. And the farther in you get, the deeper you go, but the higher it takes you. So you start to you stick there. I stayed because I mean I was already there. And
Yeah.
at some point, like one of my sisters said, she said at some point I realized I left Protestantism a long time ago. And that's kind of a shocking realization too, because you're saying, well, I'm holding on to this. And then at some point you're saying, do I even want to hold on to that? Because the parts of it that I dearly love are still here. Even though I love parts of my tradition there, and there are parts that I won't be a part of, but you're picking between three different things, and you're holding on to A, and then you're trying to choose between B and C. And eventually you start to look and say, do I really want A or can I just take B and C? And eventually you're like, I can take B and C. So I did stay, was going to mass, and um, I think I may have discovered Father Mike before that 1 year in, but I kind of knew, well, that was okay. This was a big thing. I needed community. That was a huge thing because I remember my cousin telling me in high school that the after college years are far weirder and more lonely than the college years. And she was right because at least with college, you've got a group, you've got your set schedule, you've got your places that you go, and you know what the next year is bringing. Out of college, all bets are off. Your friends are far away, they're in a different state most of the time, and you are looking for where you're going to belong in life and who you're supposed to be and what you're supposed to be doing. And to find friends because I was out of state. So when you come back, I'm going, okay, well, I need a circle and I have all my siblings, which are great. My siblings are some of my best friends. And I had some really good friends here, which was helpful. But to find a Catholic community, one, I wanted to, and two, I didn't because I thought I had a good community and Catholics are kind of stuffy. They can't sing. And I was raised with a really good singing family. And so kind of a stop. Actually, when I went to a John Michael Talbot concert, not well, a concert, he was coming to one of the churches and he said, it's okay. You can sing. If you're whispering and you're drowning out your neighbor, then you can, it's probably, that's not a good sign. And so I'd grown up with John Michael Talbot because my mom liked him a lot. And so I, I needed desperately a community. So in between those couple years, I started going to everything Protestant Catholic that I could find, young adult groups looking for somewhere to be.
Yeah.
And I finally just walked into the diocese office and I said, hi, I'm just trying to find friends. And I can find nothing because trying to find young adult things is like, for especially single young adult things, is like it's the island that you can only find if you already know where it is. and it's
Wow.
infuriating. And that's got to be fixed, because that was something, after a while, I said, I don't have a problem with the Eucharist. I don't have a problem with the Pope or Mary or praying to saints. I have a problem where I don't have any community. And I'm looking at the sort of community that I think I'm seeing, and I don't want it. So what else is there? I need to see that there is some sort of joy and life and camaraderie that hints at what I had. And so I ended up finding Father Dominic and the Brothers of Bourbon's Bay, and they are wonderful people. And just an old French priest who talks about metaphysics and answers questions. And it's a lot of young adults who come together and just really want to learn. And I found a really good group there. They did a retreat, and I ended up going with them. And at one point, they would have mass every morning. They'd have their morning prayers. They'd have different discussions where the brothers would help you learn things. And this was in that year before I became Catholic. And so I'm sitting there learning all these things. And I was going, did you guys know this? And they're going, yes. And I thought, oh, there's more. There was more. But it all made sense. And they were so friendly and down to earth and good. And at one point in one of the prayers, I looked around, and it was almost like God said, there's that community you've been looking for. There are normal people. So I thought, thank you very much. This was an answer to prayer. So I ended up staying there. And then I was sitting there. There's always something about jitters about, do I actually, once you take the final step in becoming Catholic, that's it. You can go from Catholic to Protestant, and you've kind of hit a ledge somewhere up here. But once you go from Protestant to Catholic, you have hit solid ground, and that is where you stay. There's no getting out of it. And so it really is kind of like, you've got to know enough about it, kind of like a marriage, to where you are confident enough this side of a commitment that you can reasonably take the step, because you know as much as you're going to here. But if you ever want to know more, you have to move forward. You have to take that next step. So it kind of got to that point, and a friend of mine, I was going wishy-washy back and forth and not really wanting to. And I hadn't really been too much to RCIA that year. And a friend of mine said, do you really want to spend another year like this in limbo? And I was like, no. And so I called up this RCIA leader who knew me quite well by that point. And I said, listen, I've taken all the classes. Can I just graduate? And she said, of course, I'm delighted. And so I ran down there and I cried in her office for the upteenth time. And we picked, all the things out and made sure that all the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed. And so I was delighted that time, because then it was actually kind of, I don't like making decisions, but there is great relief in making a decision and choosing to belong somewhere because you have studied it enough that you find it credible. And C.S. Lewis talks about this on one of the kinds of faith, that you have studied something enough to where your reason takes over when your emotions get in the way, to say, I have studied this enough and found it credible throughout this time, and now my emotions get like this.
Yeah.
But I'm going to choose to hold on to the solid rock that my reason has previously established. And so once you can kind of make a decision after all that, then it's actually quite easy. And so got all that settled out. And I told my sister at one point, and I said, I don't even have a saint, like a confirmation saint. And she looks at me and she goes, of course it's Mary Magdalene. And I said, oh, because in this lovely Protestant tradition that I came from, there's this massive Easter pageant, like a 45-year tradition.
Yeah.
And at one point, this director, wonderful woman, heard this song and said, I want to put this in and I want to write in a Mary Magdalene character. Will you play it? And so I got to play Mary Magdalene for about 5-6 years. And it was truly lovely. And you get to start to understand what it might have been to be there, which is one of the things that I love about theater, is it takes people, even cradle Catholics would come and be in this show and said that it really changed them, because for the first time, the gospel was moving around them and coming to life. And Jesus touched my hand. I know it was the actor, but it felt like Jesus, and so it's this really lovely thing. So Mary Magdalene was my saint, and I went through and got confirmed, and I was really quite pleased. And once you've come that far, I haven't hit the next roadblock yet. So far, so good.
That's very, very realistic, very, very
Yeah.
practical of you. No, that's what I really respect about what you just shared. Very, very honest about the difficulties that so many will thank you for sharing real thoughts. It's not, for so many people, it's not as if a switch goes on and they walk right into RCIA. And so you really touched on that, and I appreciate that. What about receiving the Holy Eucharist? So I know that you had mentioned you had already understood as best you can that teaching. What was it like to receive the Eucharist, and what has the journey been like since 2023? Saying that you have not hit any roadblocks, that's great.
Yeah. Um, it was easier to understand because my parents had this background studying Judaism. And if you're looking at the Passover Supper with the Passover lamb, and then Jesus who says, I am the lamb, you have to eat the Passover lamb or else the sacrifice is not complete. And so it's really not that weird once you look at it to say Jesus said he's the lamb and you have to eat it. It's like, well, it's the same thing. It's just the fulfillment of. So once, and all the Jews probably would have said, weird, but which is why they all left and only the apostles were there. And Jesus didn't change his mind. He just looked at them and said, do you want to leave too?
Yeah,
And they didn't say they didn't. They just said, where else would we go? And that's very
exactly.
relatable. So that was really comforting. The first time I guess I took, actually, that wasn't the first time I took the Eucharist. And I had to confess, and I think that the priest was okay with this, because at one point during this dark night of the soul, I was so desperate that I went to a Catholic church, and I didn't know all the things about it. I just knew you weren't probably supposed to do this unless you were Catholic for reasons. But I was so desperate that I did. And it was only once. And I felt like that woman who's just crawling to Jesus to
Touches
touch his
him.
cloak.
Yeah.
And I was just like apologizing the whole way, but I was like, I don't know what else to do. And so I went, and I feel like God probably forgave me. But once becoming Catholic, the I yes, it was very special, but at the same time, I was going, don't forget to do this, don't forget to do that, what hand, and don't drop it. So there are all these different pieces that you're going, there are the people and they're watching.
Yeah.
So once you can get over the hype of not feeling like there are eyes on you, something that I knew beforehand intellectually, but you kind of figure out more, is that there is tremendous grace in the sacraments.
Yes.
And that's one of the reasons that I kind of knew that I needed to become Catholic, is that there is a means of grace that somehow there are constructs, there are rules for a reason, but you've got to follow the rules if you want to find the solution. It's this plus this plus this equals this in some way, not a cosmic vending machine, but in some way there's a path kind of laid out. And another thing that was neat is that I guess it was last January, probably December. So I guess a full year ago.
Hmm.
And I was at this group that I had found with the brothers, and Father Dominic comes up to me after never speaking to me personally. And he comes up to me and he goes, hey, you need to go to this thing. Tell her about it, to one of the brothers. And I said, okay, all right, I'll go. And I didn't know what it was, but it was a trip for a World Youth Day this last July. And I thought, well, that would be handy if I were Catholic. And I was already thinking I should probably become Catholic. This was December 2022. So that was right before I converted in Easter 2023. And so the brothers told me about it, and it turned out they were doing the last 6 days of the Camino with the brothers and a small group of young adults, and they were then going on to World Youth Day, which I had no idea what it was, and I just signed up and I said, what is this? And then they told me. But my sister had been on the Camino previous, she'd done the whole thing, and so I knew what that was. And I figured if a priest comes up and tells you point blank, you should go to this, then probably it's a good idea to pay attention. So I ended up signing up for that. And what was so nice about it is that I had converted just a few months before I went on this trip. And so we had mass all the time because we were
Beautiful.
traveling with a priest, and you could actually partake. And you could we went to, of course, to the big cathedral in Santiago, and went to mass, and continued to this huge vigil at World Youth Day. And there was a lot of grace that was around there with the people that I met, with the things that I was able to learn. And I feel like it was not entirely new eyes, but at the same time, entirely new eyes, which was really lovely. So it was a change, and there is something that is an accountability. There's something that is an extra hug from God. There's something that is a clearer path forward. And in some way, it's learning how to see again, which is interesting.
Well said. Is there anything else that you want to add about your journey? Any other moments that we may have jumped
Thinking
over?
I wrote down. I don't think so, other than um, one thing that's been really lovely and kind of eye-opening and shocking at first is the number of people, because I was raised in pro-life circles, but the number of people who are Catholic in those circles. And it's kind of like all of a sudden you are given the awareness of the color blue. And once you start to look around the world,
All
you're
you see.
going, it's everywhere. I'm surrounded. And so once you can see that all of these people who are doing all of these things, and you start to notice how many of them are Catholic, and that was something also that was really kind of influential, because it's going, well, clearly they can't all be nuts. Like, there's something there, that the number of people that I admire for doing these things, and yet they're all Catholic. And so, that's not all. There are some very, very good people that are Protestant. Occasionally, you find an atheist that are doing really good things in those circles. And my parents, always were in those circles with them, Protestant and Catholic, doing that. So, but it's been really nice. I've gotten to meet the Sisters of Life and kind of look through their things, and it's just been a pleasure to see.
That's so great. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks again.
Thank
That
you.
was well
Appreciate
well
it.
stated, so well stated, and going to be so helpful for so many people. I just know it. Everyone needs to hear that level of honesty about the journey, and it takes a lot of courage to even. It takes courage. It's so interesting to think about, but when you went twice to RCIA and knew it wasn't right, God's going to use that. He's going to use it in a very dramatic way. I wholeheartedly believe that that all happened for a very specific reason. And yeah, there were certain things that you were saying that resonated. I mean, this takes me back even 5 years, thoughts that I was having, thoughts that my wife was having when she was considering. She was kind of like, oh, I feel like I'm not Protestant, I'm not Catholic, I'm free falling. What is going on? So when you said that, it just, yeah, it was really, really helpful. So thanks again.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Everyone, thank you for watching, and please share this video. Until next time, take care and God bless.